Hi, and welcome to another Bible story. And today we are on Genesis 19, when doing the right thing is the hard thing. And this is the story that talks about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot. And it is a really difficult chapter. In fact, it's a chapter that has been used to hurt people. It's been used as a weapon. It's been used in a way that is hurtful and painful, and that's not okay. As I've said before, scripture is not a weapon. And this is such a hard chapter that it's so easily, when we're like, ew, yuck, we want to check out. But what's important here is for us to begin to dig a little bit deeper, to pull back the layers, to look at, all right, what are the cultural norms of the time? What's the writer trying to do? What is the deeper meaning here, instead of staying on the surface and going, ooh, I don't like that. So as we get into this chapter, it's important for us to know this is from the J writer. Everything except for verse 29, that's the P writer, the priestly writer. And the J writer, just a reminder, the J writer is writing during the time period writers of that school of thought are writing around the times of King David and King Solomon. So this is the early monarch period. The J writer is very concerned with the political and social things happening within the monarchy. The J writer also is very much about, all right, humans are fallible. Humans often try to be God, and it gets them in trouble every single time. With the P writer, that P verse of verse 29, P writer, much later than the J writer. P is writing during the Babylonian exile period. The P writer standing for priestly. It's all about how one orders their life, how one goes through life. And we're looking there at easily from 550 to 450 BCE. Because the goal of the priestly writer, the P writer, is that they've got to deal with the insecurities of being in exile. They've got to figure out how to order their life that is directly related and focused upon God, because they aren't home. And so just to keep those in mind as we are reading through, especially with the J writer, and showing that humans fail, are imperfect, and often try to act like God, and all the consequences of that. The geography of this area is that research suggests that the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were located somewhere in what is now the shallow waters, like 18 feet deep, the shallow waters of the southern part of the Dead Sea. So no longer present. Some interesting things to note of how this passage is broken down. So it has three sections. First section, verses 1 through 11. The angels are investigating the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah and the righteousness of Lot. 2 is the escape of Lot's family, verses 12 through 29, and the destruction of the cities. And then 3 is the birth of Lot's sons, verses 30 through 38. So in that first part of verses 1 through 11, Lot shows hospitality to the strangers. And it's genuine, it's authentic, but it's not the level that Abraham showed to strangers in the previous chapter. So the writer is trying to make a very strong distinction between the way Abraham acts and the righteousness of Abraham, and the way Lot acts. And Lot, yeah, some hospitality, but still not quite as good. And so we can see that where Lot gets up to meet them, whereas Abraham runs to meet them. Abraham gives the strangers the best cakes and the best flour, and Lot's like, oh, here's some unleavened bread. Abraham allows the strangers to eat first, and then Lot is like, no, everybody's just at the table. So it's just little distinctions that show that Lot has hospitality, it's just not as good as. It's also showing that, yeah, Lot is not all bad, but he's also not righteous. Like, there's some real issues with Lot. So the shamefulness, the wickedness of looking at Sodom consists of behavior towards strangers. So the city, the other men besides Lot of Sodom, actually are not hospitable. They do not extend hospitality to the stranger. In fact, they're going to do the exact opposite of that. They are actually going to try to sexually assault, which is an act of domination and an act of trying to shame someone else. And it's kind of crazy because Lot's response, which also shows that Lot is not righteous. Lot's response, he's going to maintain his honor by protecting the stranger. So that's a good part. But then he offers his virgin daughters as surrogate victims to be sexually assaulted. And so that's awful, right? I mean, that is just terrible. So it's like he kind of is making the right decision in one way, but then he makes the wrong decision because it's the hard decision. And so we get that the men then threaten to assault Lot, and it's unclear exactly how they're going to assault or whether they're actually going to murder him. And because of Lot offering hospitality to the stranger, it is then possible for the stranger, like those messengers from God, actually save Lot's life. They pull him into the house. And it's interesting because this story is related to Judges 19, verses 16 through 26. And with that, it's a very disturbing story as well. We get a Levite and his concubine, and ultimately the concubine is murdered. And it's one of those things where the city turns on the stranger, turns on the foreigner, that because they are less than, and so that they think they can dominate and assault and do whatever they want because they are the stranger. So some scholars think that the tale in Judges 19 is actually an earlier version of this story of Lot. It's also kind of weird to think about the entire male population of the city is outside of Lot's house. Like, that's a lot of people. And a lot for Lot. Anyway, this description is it's like total depravity. And it's so bad here that it warrants destruction. And there were clear instructions in chapter 18 from Abraham pleading for, if there are any righteous people, please save the city. And there are no righteous people. So that whole congregating outside of Lot's house is also showing. And even Lot and his family is not righteous. And so then the men complain with Lot is responding to them that Lot is appearing to be judgmental. And everything is about to be judged. And so it's kind of this odd moment in the story. When understanding what is the sin, what is the wickedness of Sodom, many have jumped to particular conclusions, and there are reasons to that, and we will get to those, but they are much later interpretations. But the biblical text, the Bible, in the Old Testament, actually, the Hebrew scriptures actually gives us what the wickedness is in other books. In Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 16:49, comments on what Sodom's sin, iniquity, wickedness is, and it was the city's unwillingness due to their pride and arrogance. So they're prideful and arrogant, so they are unwilling then to share their abundance with those who are poor and marginalized. So they are unwilling to help people who are vulnerable. And then in Isaiah gives us yet another piece to this. In Isaiah 1:10 through 17, Israel is actually referred to as Sodom and Gomorrah because it was committing the same acts that led to the destruction of those cities. And what are those acts that Israel sinned, that Israel is committing? It is a lack of justice done in the name of orphans and widows. Again, they are not caring for the vulnerable. They are not caring for the poor. They are not caring and helping others. And because they are mistreating those who are most vulnerable, that is considered the sin, the wickedness, the oppression that is the reason for their destruction. So we can hear it as the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, according to the Bible, was a lack of justice done in the name of society's dispossessed, society's vulnerable. With verses 12 through 29, This second section, the angels extend the protection to Lot, rescuing him and blinding the wicked men in return for his attempt to protect them, kind of like I said earlier. Lot is kind of ineffectual and almost comic in that he fails to convince his prospective son-in-laws to flee in verse 14. He can't convince anybody else, hey, there's a problem here, you got to get out. And the people around him think he's joking. Lot's extended family, like his family, laughs at him, and it's a laughter that results in death. So, which is also a juxtaposition to the laughter of like Sarah and Abraham that results in life. So here, the laughter results in death. And then Lot hesitates to leave himself. So like the angel has to seize him and his family. It's like they are dragging them out of Sodom. So Lot and his family, not righteous. He hesitates in trusting the divine messengers to flee. So he's like insisting on, no, I want to be taken to this other city. And finally he succumbs to drunkenness, which leads to incestuous relationships. Like he is not a good guy. He's done at least one thing by protecting the messengers, but he's not a good guy in other ways. So what is this talking about then? Like we're talking about like Lot is saved because of God's grace, because God had grace on Lot because of Abraham and not by any works. Like it was Abraham going, please save Lot. And so to recognize that we cannot earn grace from God, which is actually kind of wonderful and beautiful in and of itself, and that all of us are struggling and can still experience God's grace. So, though Lot is not great, his wife is worse because she can't resist peeking back at the city. After they are like, do not turn back, do not look back, you got to keep on going. She looks back and she turns into a pillar of salt. And so she becomes part of the landscape of the Dead Sea region. She's a pillar of salt. And so if you go to that region, you can see different pillars of salt that kind of have a human form. She is nameless. She has no name in the biblical text. The only time that we get a name for her is out of a midrash. And that midrash is called Sefer HaYashar and also known as the Book of Jasher. And so there's other writings that name her, but the biblical text does not. And her transformation, just kind of like I was saying, could be trying to explain the natural formations of the Dead Sea region, of these salt pillars that look like humans. Josephus and at the same time, his contemporary Clement of Rome both make that jump. So the first century, they're like, oh, they've seen the pillar of salt. They actually claim to see the pillar of salt that was Lot's wife. And about a century later, we get Irenaeus, who also claims of seeing the pillar that was once Lot's wife. But here's what's interesting. Lot's wife gets turned to salt, but when Abraham looks towards Sodom's destruction, he is not turned to a pillar of salt. So there's something different about the way he looks upon the situation and the way Lot's wife looks upon the situation. There's a sense that Lot's wife looks back in longing, of wanting to go back to, of wanting that life which is not good, is not healthy. And then Sodom is often associated with one of the kind of the tells of the southeastern Dead Sea shore. These cities were occupied during the 3rd and early 2nd century BC. So this is long after this story is being told. This is long after, centuries upon centuries after not only it's being told, but even after it's finally written down. Centuries later, these cities still exist. So several issues are kind of at stake here. First, Lot's afraid of the hill country and some unknown disaster. Second, he presents Zor, this other city, as a less significant city than the cities of the plain. Like he's begging, I want to go there. And then third, Lot is concerned to save his life, which is not, it's a challenge in this moment. And it's not necessarily clear that he's concerned about anybody else's life, more than just telling people, hey, you might want to get out. Fourth is based upon the messenger's response in verses 21 through 22. Lot is in effect asking that Zor be spared from destruction, in which case we know that it is one of the cities of the plain and it is destroyed. This language that you'll find of sulfur and fire, along with the verb to rain, it's supposed to be ironic, right? Rain and fire, that's supposed to be ironic. And fire and sulfur, they're kind of like a stock image, like just a regular image in the Old Testament to describe the destruction of a city or nation. In verse 29, this is where we get P, the P rider. The scene shifts to God's perspective. And the author of 29P wants to offer a corrective, a move typical of the priestly hand, that God has remembered Abraham, and because of that, let Lot live. And the notion is similar to that of God remembering Noah and all the animals. So there's also a connection in this story, not only to Judges, but now there's a connection to the Noah story. And the priestly writer doesn't want anyone to think, though, that Lot has a status that's comparable to Noah. It's just there are similarities to kind of highlight. In verses 30 through 38, the conclusion of this Lot saga explains how it is after the death of Lot's wife that his lineage will continue. So we get the aftermath of the great destruction, where the story of Lot and his two daughters thematically echoes the aftermath of the Noah, the flood story, where in both cases, the father becomes drunk and is the object of transgression by his offspring, resulting in a shameful ancestry for Israel's neighbors. So we get Canaan, that's from the line of Noah, and then from Lot we get Moab and Ammon. And these seem to be ethnographic stories that cast aspersions on Israel's cultural rivals while acknowledging a kinship between them. So, okay, you guys are cousins, but there are issues between. And so trying to understand, why are there issues when we're related? And then there's this aspect in reading through. Lot's daughters seem to be well-intentioned because they are trying to engender offspring through their father, since they think there are no men left to impregnate them. They think the world has been destroyed, and they're so fearful that the entire world has been destroyed and that they're the only 3 people left on the planet, that now it is up to them to save humanity. They are now acting like God. They are now acting like they are the ones that know what's best, instead of going outside the cave and recognizing that, no, there are still lots of other people. Yes, those cities were destroyed, but there are still other people. So their fear is containing them, and their sense of it's all on them to save humanity, which it is never on humanity to act like God. And so this is their justification for engaging in sex with their father, and it happens to be so wrong. And since only the cities of the plain were destroyed, they don't know this, and so they create more issues. Lot, in his part, is culpable for having offered his daughter. So that's the other thing. Previously, for sexual assault, right? He's like, no, have my daughters. And now he's sown the seeds for his own. So there's like, in the story, there's this poetic justice, a measure for measure, as he is assaulted. And then we get the offspring of Lot and his daughters have names that betray their shameful origins. Moab is a play on Moab, from the father, like that's what it means, from the father. And then Ben Ami means, which gets to Ammon, son of my kinsman. So some scholars suggest that verses 37 through 38, they question it, like, was this originally part of the Lot saga? Israel is interestingly told in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy 2:9, not to attack Moab, and they are told not to attack Ammon in 2:19. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Like, Israel is told to back off. Also interesting, Moab, will be part of David's ancestry. So King David, which is maybe written by, during the time of, or it's at least being told if it hasn't been written down yet, King David's, supposedly his great-great-grandmother or great-grandmother is Ruth, who is a Moabite. So kind of interesting. And then Ammon also has a relationship in the line. King David has the child Solomon. King Solomon, one of his wives is from Ammon, and she gives birth to Rehoboam, who then becomes king after that. So it's kind of interesting how they start to incorporate, again, how the passage has been misused. It's been used to legitimize exclusion, hatred, mistreatment of the LGBTQIA plus community. The first persons that even try to connect the sin of Sodom to the LGBTQIA plus community lived centuries later than when this was written. We get Philo of Alexandria, 25 BCE to 50 CE, and then Josephus, who I mentioned earlier, 37 to 100 CE. They make this connection. Like they're kind of living in that first century. So that's how it's been misused. That's where it starts to be misused. And then it's also been used to legitimize violence towards women, and that men are more important than women. So just to note, this is how it's been misused. Scripture is never to be used as a weapon. So what are some things the scripture is trying to convey? Well, like I said in Ezekiel 16:49, that is Sodom's like whole sin, iniquity, wickedness, unrighteousness is due to that they are so prideful and arrogant that they refuse to help others. They refuse to help the most vulnerable. And that it's also trying to convey that God's anger towards Sodom and Gomorrah comes from their refusal to show hospitality to those residing on their margins, to those who are vulnerable. And hospitality in the biblical world meant more than simply being neighborly, just being kind. It was carefully orchestrated social practice to receive strangers and make them guests, like to encourage them and to elevate them in status. Strangers lacking legal standing were at the mercy of the established community leaders who were willing to serve as their hosts. Their very survival depends upon falling under the protection of a member of the town. So what this story is trying to tell us, is trying to convey, is just how important it is for us to be neighborly, to be more than just neighbors, to show hospitality, to lift others up. Also, it's trying to convey like the problem of sexual assault, sexual violence, that it is an act of domination, that it is an act of humiliation and subjugation, and that it is not okay. Like there is nothing all right about that. It's also trying to convey the hesitancy to leave. So we know this, like in other levels, in other ways, some will always prefer allegiance to their own town, state, union, family, rather than to God and to how people treat one another, and to recognize the importance of how are we treating one another, right? The first command that Jesus says is to love God. The second command is to love your neighbors as yourself. So this is trying to convey there's sometimes a hesitancy to do that. And then it's also making the theological and ethical claims that God intervenes in human history in a way that says this is no longer okay. This is no longer an okay way to live. Wickedness may feel like it's prevailing, but it can never endure. And so the wages of sin is still death. God will not forever tolerate injustice toward the poor, the alien, with whom God stands in solidarity, not because they are holier, but because they are vulnerable, they are dispossessed. And so it's also trying to convey that looking back and wishing for the past or refusing to change can have devastating consequences. It's also trying to convey that fear of moving forward, of changing, of leaving what is comfortable can leave devastating consequences. And so what can we take from this today? We can really ask ourselves, like, how are we treating one another? How are we showing hospitality to people we don't understand, to people we don't know? How are we helping others with whatever gifts and abilities we have been given? Of going, all right, am I looking too much and holding on to the past that I cannot move forward? I cannot see the good in the future. And is our refusal to change highly problematic? And are we going to experience worse consequences because we refuse to change? And so that's really important for us to consider on that. And then fear, like the purpose of thinking about, man, what kinds of fears are holding us back of creating problems in relationships, keep us from creating new relationships, keep us from helping others? What are the fears that actually are getting in the way of not only thriving for ourselves, but helping other people around us to thrive? And so I hope you found this helpful. I hope you've got questions, and if you do, please put them in the comments and I'll try to answer them. And if you have gotten this far, congratulations, because I know that this was a bit longer, but this is a really difficult passage. And so I hope that you have found this a good use for understanding this particular difficult passage of the Bible. Have a good one.